I will introduce your moderator, and your moderator will introduce the presenter and the panelists. So, alors Dan McHardie, vous le connaissez peut-être, vous le reconnaissez peut-être de CBC, avec qui il a travaillé, avec qui il est on secondment at the moment. He is at the UNB Renaissance College, and he has kindly agreed to moderate this panel. And without further ado, Dan. Should kick in. It should kick in.
Okay. Thanks for organizing this event. It's been a fascinating last few hours of discussion. We'll kick it off here. I'm not going to speak too long. I thought that everything is connecting really well. The Byrne Commission, as we've been hearing throughout the days, had such a dramatic influence on the province in the last 50 years. I was thinking back that how we started to see that influence in a pictorial sense with in Nicole Byrne's presentation with those old Gleaner editorials, and as a old newspaper reporter, it was neat to see print still having a bit of an influence. Continuing on to local government minister Danny Soucy over lunch, and he was giving some important context for how the current government is dealing with some of these local governance issues. And I'm not sure if everybody has had a chance to read through the symposium handout, but as I was doing that, there was two interesting data points that I picked out that I think is relevant to this discussion on demographics and urban centers, and I'm sure the panelists here will pick up on them. The median age in 1961 in New Brunswick was 22. In 2011, it was 43.7. So obviously, it speaks to the aging of the population. But the other one, in terms of the rural-urban split, New Brunswick is often described by many people, such as myself in the media, as a largely rural province. In 2011, 53% of New Brunswick lived in rural communities, or communities of more than 1,000 people. But if you flip it around by using Statistics Canada's Metropolitan Influence Zones metric, that's 61%. So perhaps not as rural as sometimes we think. Anyway, just what I thought was interesting is food for thought. I'm going to introduce our panel now. Dr. Michael Hahn here is a professor of sociology at UNB here in Fredericton. He's also the Canada Research Chair in Population and Social Policy. Dr. Hahn studies why immigrants make the location choices they do and what impact these choices have on their well-being and that of the communities they join. Jean-Guy Finn over at the other side of the table. He was served as the Deputy Minister of Advanced Education and Training, as well as Health and Community Services. He was also the Clerk of the Executive Council. He's currently a consultant in the public sector management and has been an advisor in countries such as South Africa, Qatar, Ethiopia, and Jordan. He was also the author of the 2008 report that looked at the organization of local governance in New Brunswick, and in this forum, I don't think anyone needs any more of an introduction of Jean-Guy Finn than that. I think we've all read his report. J.P. Lewis, further down, he's an assistant professor of political science at UNB in St. John. His major research interests are in cabinet government, citizen education with a focus on Canada, and he teaches courses on Canadian government, politics, provincial politics, federalism, elections, and political parties, and the media. And finally, next to me is Raymond Murphy. He's Executive Director of the Union of New Brunswick Municipalities. He's been in that position since 2004. He's also a former mayor and village councillor from Rexton. And just as perhaps a personal note, I met Mr. Murphy shortly after I came to New Brunswick in 2001, and he was always my go-to person, so I knew how to understand rural and small communities governance. So I've see this as kind of coming full circle, so I'll be interested to see how things have evolved in the last 13 years or so. But anyway, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Hahn right now. He's going to have a presentation, and then we'll each go through some other short presentations, and we'll take questions and answers.
Great, thank you very much, Dan. Good afternoon, everyone. As Dan said, my name is Michael Hahn. I am a relative newcomer to New Brunswick, so please, I'll throw this out as a qualifier. Everything I say is coming out of the mouth of someone who's come from away. So please don't hold that against me. One of the things I'm happy about being here today is that I have a growing interest in understanding the relationship that exists between local policies, whether they be provincial or municipal, and the effect that this has on population growth and movement. So I'm going to talk to you today about 3 things, and if I had a wish list in half an hour or 45 minutes, I would probably add another 3 or 4 things to this list. I would look at interprovincial migration, I would look at changes in fertility rates, and I would look at mortality, because they're also important factors for understanding municipal trends, at least demographic municipal trends. But for today, I'm going to talk to you about age composition of our population, urbanization rates, and our lingual composition. Okay? So first, age composition. Well, the story of New Brunswick is relatively boring if you zoom out to the right level. So here we have our population growth rates from 1911 more or less up to the present. And what you see is that in 1911, we had 350,000 people living here. And by 2006, we had barely doubled that population. So what that should suggest right away is that we have had a relatively stale and stable population. And to some extent, this is the case. But once you zoom in a little bit more and you start to look at what's been happening subprovincially, you get a radically different story. So this isn't 1911 to 2006, but what it is instead is looking at the change at the level of what Statistics Canada geography of census subdivision, which is more or less a municipality. And I calculated the percent change by municipality over a 20-year period. So what you see, the light yellows and orange colors denote negative growth, and all of the light bluer colors denote positive growth. So yes, there is some evidence that there has been a shift or a migration southward, but the full story, I think, is a little more complicated than that. There are high growth regions in the north. Some, not many, but they're there. So there is a little bit more of a story than just talking about southward migration. If you look at the next slide, which is the growth rates between 2006 and 2011, I think the story becomes a lot more interesting. So a little bit of background. Those large green tabs denote any region that has grown by more than 10%. The small green dots between 0 and 10%, and the red denotes negative growth of the same magnitudes. So areas popping up all over the province that are growing quickly, other areas that are shrinking quite rapidly. Remember, this is just a 5-year time frame. And I argue that we don't really know why this is happening at all. We know a little bit about trends towards urbanization. There's quite a literature on that. We don't yet, I haven't seen too many people try to drill down using, historical census data and identifying how this is relevant or whether it is relevant to the New Brunswick story, because New Brunswick is a distinct case. We also don't know who exactly is on the move all the time. We have a pretty good sense that it's young people, but do we know if it's well-educated young people? Is it people that are looking for education? Is it people that have received their education and are making the next move? These are open questions. So it's a really exciting and interesting time to study these things in New Brunswick, and I'm delighted, I'm eagerly anticipating the comments from the panel, because I know they're going to have lots of insights here. When the Byrne report, when the Byrne report, just before the Byrne report was commissioned, this was the age composition of our population. So everybody's familiar with population pyramids. If you've ever taken a demography class, they would have been the bane of your existence. What this shows is that at the time, New Brunswick had an awful lot of young people. This is a distribution, oh, you can't see the red line on here. This is a distribution of the population by sex and age. On the left, you have males in blue. On the right, you have females in red. Frequency by age. Lots of young people in New Brunswick in 1961. In fact, New Brunswick had Canada's second largest baby boom. And I'll return to that in a moment. When the Byrne report was commissioned, they were struggling with things like education, where to build schools, how they were possibly going to contribute.
Sorry, Michael.
Sure.
If you need to point, here's a clicker.
Oh, great. Okay, great. Thank you. Where to put schools, how to handle the economic growth that was going to result from this type of a population boom. Now, zoom ahead to 2011, this is what our population looks like. So everything has changed. Now, we're talking about how we're going to build hospitals. How are we going to take care of our pension problems? What are we going to do when people start to hit the age of retirement and exit the workforce? How will we maintain our levels of productivity? Everything is different now. This is what we're going to look like in 2036. Looking at this blue line, I'll figure this out. This blue line denotes what our population our age composition is projected to be into the future. So in this context, we have to make serious decisions and have a long discussion about the kind of New Brunswick that we're going to see and that we're going to have moving forward. Okay, urbanization. Related to the age composition comment, but so I'll zoom through it, but still, it is distinct in and of itself. Atlantic Canada is currently experiencing the highest and quickest rates of urbanization of any part of Canada. So you'll see on the left-hand side, the 4 sets of bars denote the change in the proportion of the population that moved from a rural area to an urban area. So we see each province has experienced significant decline. At the same time, each province is well above the national average. So we have urbanization rates that are approximately where the rest of Canada was in around 1940. So we're seeing big changes, bigger changes than anyone else. And you might wonder, does this then mean that we're starting to urbanize and that we're just going to continue to plod towards an urban ecosystem? Well, not necessarily. And this is why I think New Brunswick is such an interesting case study. It was the only jurisdiction in North America that experienced negative urbanization in recent history. Look at what happened. So in 1981, we started to see declines in the proportion of people that are urban, and then it's dipped up again. Perhaps the panel has some thoughts on why this has occurred. As again, somebody who's come from away, this really stood out to me. I thought it was quite unique because I haven't seen it anywhere else. So we're not necessarily going to just continue to urbanize. There might be underlying politics that I certainly don't understand, and perhaps other people in the room know a lot more about than I do. Third thing, the lingual composition of the New Brunswick population. What's been happening over time? Well, what we've seen is, the short story is what we've seen is gradual change in the composition of New Brunswick's population. So in 1951, there were 185,000 people that are francophones, and they represented about 36% of the population. Fast forward to 2006, not a whole lot has changed, but there has been a bit of a change in the relative proportion of the population that speaks French as their mother tongue. We're down to 32.7% now. This has been jointly made up by an increase in the proportion of Anglophones, but also other languages. So now 2.6% of our population, and I apologize to the people on this side of the room who can't see it, 2.6% of our population now has a mother tongue other than English or French. This is new, this is growth. What will that mean for municipalities and for the settlement services that they provide? These are open questions. Finally, fertility. So if you were a francophone female between 1956 and 1961, you would have had, on average, 5.91 children. Mon Dieu. I don't speak French, but I don't speak a lot of French, but I can say that. 5.91 children. Anglophones, on the other hand, 4.7 children. Just a small family in comparison. Now, look what's happened since then. It's flipped. Again, we don't know why. 1.3 compared to 1.5. Both well below the average, and both well below replacement, but there's a gap. What is that gap all about? Where's it coming from? Is there anything that the province or municipality can do to address that gap? Because what that's going to equate to is an ongoing and growing chasm between Francophone and Anglophone populations. There'll be a decreasing share. So taking a close look at what's been happening there, I think, is of utmost importance. Francophones in New Brunswick are extremely clustered. The dark red regions, purplish regions, denote any municipality where at least 70% of the population speaks French as has French as their mother tongue. As the colors lighten, the numbers go down. Until you get into the south where you have these green regions, And those are areas that are in the 0 to the 10%. And if any of you are wondering why there are some areas around Fredericton that are lighter, it's because Fredericton is also receiving people from the north. And it's lightening the colors there. So there are francophone, mild francophone communities forming around Fredericton, which I think is really interesting. But for the most part, we continue to see extremely high levels of concentration. So Eve gave me 15 minutes, and I thought I'd stick to it because otherwise I'd get the hook. I have 3 major conclusions. One, there's been a massive change since the Byrne report in regional population growth. At the same time, the population of the province overall hasn't changed that much. Second, we've seen massive shifts within the province. And finally, and I didn't have a lot of time to talk about this, but I can say a few notes before Eve gets down the stairs, talking about migration out of the province. If you look at age-specific out-migration rates in New Brunswick, one of the things that jump out is that there are massive amounts of young people leaving. So on an annual basis in New Brunswick, between 3 and 4% of 21-year-olds leave the province, for example. And another 2 or 3% of 22-year-olds, so those that didn't leave when they were 21, another 2 or 3% of 22-year-olds leave. So what ends up happening is you have this constant shedding of our young people. We don't know anything about who leaves, why they leave, how long they're gone for, where in the province they're leaving from. And I think these are all really interesting and important questions, because if there's anything that we can learn about what happened since the Byrne Commission, it's that the baby boomers went through this exact pattern. They elicited the same levels of out-migration. 300,000 baby boomers, people born between 1946 and 1965, 300,000 baby boomers, 150,000 of them left. Sure, many came back subsequently, but this level of out-migration warrants our close attention, because if we're going to reverse some of the municipal issues that we're talking about, it will start with young people and individuals staying in New Brunswick. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. While Eve gets another presentation ready, Jean-Guy, do you want to come up?
Alors, pendant que Yves s'occupe des considérations techniques, je veux simplement le remercier de l'invitation à participer à ce symposium. Et comme je n'ai pas tellement de temps, je passerai pas beaucoup de temps sur les préliminaires. Je passerai directement, évidemment, au vif des sujets, à savoir les recommandations de Byrne et ce qu'on en pense 50 ans après.
Ils sont censés être synchronisés. Je vais juste vérifier. OK. En faisant les flèches par en envoyer moi tous les deux changements.
OK, merci. So I have a short presentation here in 8 or 9 slides. Some of these slides are a little bit busy, but I'll leave this behind so you can look at them at leisure after the presentation. Je vais faire ma présentation en partie en français, en partie en anglais, et les 2 tableaux ici vous fourniront des copies françaises et anglaises de la présentation. So, in the mid-1960s, we had Byrne, and we had immediately after, based on Byrne, we had what we call equal opportunities. And the two together were designed to address some very specific issues. And note that the Byrne Commission, note the title, it was about taxation and financing. The word local government organization is not part of the title. And as I will point out, it was not a very basic preoccupation within the body of the report either, contrary to the general perception. Alors, quels étaient les problèmes que Byrne et Chance égale visaient à solutionner? Eh bien, il y avait à ce moment-là des services publics essentiels, certains services publics essentiels, comme la santé, l'éducation, la justice et le bien-être social, qui étaient des services de qualité, de faible qualité, qui étaient organisés de manière très inefficace et qui étaient très inégalement distribués sur l'ensemble du territoire du Nouveau-Brunswick. On avait aussi à ce moment-là un système de taxation foncière qui était essentiellement anachronique, inéquitable et aussi inefficace. Et finalement, on avait des gouvernements de comté. Certains étaient en banqueroute et d'autres étaient sur le point de l'être. Alors, essentiellement, those were the issues that the Byrne Commission was set out to address and that equal opportunity was supposed to resolve based on Byrne. So when you combine Byrne and EO, and you look at it 50 years after, one can say that there are some paradoxical outcomes. On the one hand, I'll go with the positive here. On the one hand, you got a much improved and evenly distributed set of key public services, the four that I mentioned earlier. So that was addressed very successfully. And also addressed successfully was a more equitable, a more effective property taxation system. Remember that each community, each county before had its own taxation system with its own property evaluation system for a purpose of local taxation. So that problem was addressed. And thirdly, we got, as a result of Byrne and EO, we got a much stronger and modernized provincial public administration. Donc, d'un côté, il y a ces aspects-là, ces aspects positifs, et qui ont visé à solutionner des problèmes très particuliers. Et je pense que sur ce plan-là, que et Byrne et Chance égale, ensemble, ont trouvé des solutions à cette problématique. Mais de l'autre côté, comme résultat, ce qui en résulte véritablement, c'est un système de gouvernement local extrêmement faible et qui est devenu, à mon sens, une des principales barrières au développement économique, sinon la principale barrière au développement économique et social au Nouveau-Brunswick. Et c'est le cas particulièrement dans le nord de la province, où il y a une absence d'un centre de population suffisamment important pour avoir un pouvoir d'attraction. Et à mon avis, s'il y avait un tel centre de population dans le nord de la province, une bonne partie de la migration qui s'est faite vers Moncton, en particulier, et vers le sud, de façon plus générale, se serait faite probablement vers ce centre de population du nord, si celui-ci avait existé. Mais malheureusement, avec la fragmentation qui s'est développée au cours des années subséquentes, un tel centre de population n'a jamais existé. Il n'existe toujours pas, d'ailleurs, dans le nord de la province. Plusieurs ont dit que Byrne et Chance égale, et en particulier Byrne, était en avant de son temps à certains égards. Et je pense que c'est vrai. Et c'est surtout pour ça qu'on considère Byrne comme ayant été si important. Je pense que Byrne était en avant de son temps à certains égards en particulier. Spécifiquement, en ce qui touche la taxation foncière et l'évaluation des propriétés pour des fins de taxation. Je pense que les propositions de Byrne, là, étaient exceptionnellement, je dirais, intelligentes et avaient cerné le problème de façon très particulière. La même chose, donc, non seulement le système de taxation, mais aussi toute la question de la collecte des impôts fonciers et aussi de la question de la facturation et la façon aussi de gérer l'ensemble des revenus en provenance de la taxation foncière. Et aussi, troisième élément, en ce qui touche les finances publiques, la formule d'octroi aux municipalités, qui comprenait à ce moment-là un élément, une composante de péréquation. Donc, qui permettait aux municipalités et aux régions moins fortunées de pouvoir offrir des services à des taux de taxation relativement similaires. Donc, sur le plan des finances publiques, donc des finances, et en particulier de la taxation foncière, je pense que le rapport Byrne était en avant de son temps. Il était aussi en avant de son temps en ce qui touche la répartition des responsabilités entre les communautés locales et la province. Et sur ce plan-là, le Nouveau-Brunswick est encore, grâce à ce que Byrne a proposé, le Nouveau-Brunswick est encore en avance de la plupart des provinces canadiennes sur ce plan-là. Quant à la clarté, si vous voulez, de la distribution des responsabilités entre les collectivités locales et le gouvernement provincial. Cependant, ce qu'il faut dire, c'est que autant Byrne a été, et Chance-Égale était, si vous voulez, brave en termes des recommandations qu'ils ont faites sur cette question, ces deux questions-là en particulier, ils ont été particulièrement timides en ce qui touche toutes les questions fondamentales d'organisation de la gouvernance locale. En fait, si vous lisez Byrne attentivement, il avait assez peu à dire sur l'organisation des gouvernements locaux. Assez peu. Ça se résumait essentiellement à sa proposition touchant l'abolition des gouvernements de comté, qui existaient à ce moment-là, il y en avait 15. Ça touchait aussi la question des régions non incorporées, ce qu'on appelle maintenant les DSL. Et troisième élément, où il y avait des propositions concernant la gouvernance locale, c'était sur la création de ce qu'ils appelaient à ce moment-là les conseils métropolitains, Metropolitan Council, ce qui était essentiellement une forme de gouvernance régionale à ce moment-là. Et ces conseils métropolitains avaient pour but de permettre le partage de certains services essentiels et le partage des coûts aussi de ces services-là entre les communautés avoisinantes. Mais sur d'autres questions, tout aussi fondamentales, touchant la gouvernance locale, Byrne est à peu près muet sur ces questions-là. For example, on the number and the size of local entities, almost nothing in Byrne, came out of Byrne. Existing cities, towns, and villages were left intact. Byrne was too concerned, and I'm quoting here, with bitter conflict of local interests. What has changed? Okay? So he didn't dare make any recommendation on this, on the size, therefore, and number of municipalities. He didn't have anything to say about the criteria, i.e. population-based and tax-based, for the creation of municipal governments. Nothing. On the classification of local entities between towns, cities, and villages, not much either, almost nothing. On the responsibilities to be assigned to local governments, well, it was kind of a residual that was going to the local government. And there was this notion that there was services to persons that would be the responsibility of provincial government, and there would be services to properties that would be the responsibility of local government. That was how it was divided, and therefore the municipalities were left with what was called services to properties, without much more definition of that. Oh, we know now today that municipalities look after responsibilities more than that are broader than just services to properties. But that was essentially the definition. And there was, except for this Metropolitan Council, there was an absence of any proposal regarding the sharing of services between neighboring municipalities or local governments. And there was also an absence of a mechanism allowing for the adjustment of boundaries to reflect shifting demographic and economic conditions, because that was bound to happen over time. I mean, there was to be changes in demography and changes in the economy, and therefore there should be some kind of mechanism that would allow periodic adjustment of local government boundaries, but there was nothing to that effect in the report. So essentially then, what I'm saying is that Byrne had relatively limited set of recommendations pertaining specifically to the organization of local governance in New Brunswick. Its recommendations are largely around taxation and financing of government. And, of course, about the division of responsibilities regarding the 4 Bs: justice, education, welfare, and health. Now, that situation, the fact that Byrne had little to say about those issues of local governance, was kind of amplified, usually, by equal opportunity and the choices that were made by the government of the day leading to equal opportunity. Because equal opportunity ignored Byrne's recommendation on the need for the mandatory provision of joint services. That was the Metropolitan Council, remember, that was to be created to allow for the sharing of services and costs between neighboring communities. Well, the equal opportunity ignored that. And the reason why Byrne was proposing that, and that's quite interesting, he wasn't mincing words, okay, and I'm quoting. He said that was absolutely necessary to save municipalities from their own follies, a type of folly founded in human nature itself. So, I mean, he was very concerned about this lack of cooperation, obviously, and a willingness to share between neighboring entities. But nevertheless, equal opportunity chose not to pursue that particular recommendation. Equal opportunity did not heed either Byrne's warning that failure to integrate the development of contiguous urban areas inevitably results in fragmented, often chaotic, and always costly consequences. Okay? That warning was not heeded by equal opportunity. And finally, the third thing I think that both Byrne and equal opportunity were guilty of is of adopting a laissez-faire approach on most local governance organization issues. There was very little that they had to say on that. So, as a result, what have we got? We have got, in my view, an unplanned and unwillingly created, unwillingly I mean by that, if we were to willingly today, intentionally create a local governance landscape in New Brunswick, it's very unlikely that we would create something that would look like what we have today. So what we've got is, as I said, an unplanned and unwillingly created local governance landscape, which can be described in the way it's summarized there. And very quickly, and you all know this, but we need to go over that, okay, to understand what we've got today. 101 municipalities, that was the last count, unless something has changed in the last few months. Made up of what? Made up of cities, which are supposed to have 10,000 population or more, and towns, which are supposed to have 1,500 population or more, and villages, which have no floor in terms of population. There's no criteria. So, and as a result, right after equal opportunity was implemented in the 1970s, you got a whole series of new municipalities that were created, okay? Over 60 of them. Some with less than 150 people in them. And you got the creation of about 225 local service districts over and above that. That was immediately after Byrne was put in place. I'll come back to that in a minute. So the majority of the villages, not the cities, not the towns, but the villages, as they are defined in the legislation, were created after 1966. The population range for these entities, the cities, there are 8 of them. Population varies from 7,400 to 68,000. But remember, the minimum was supposed to be 10,000. Okay. Towns, 27 of them. The population varies between 950 and 18,000. Remember, the criteria was to be 1,500 people as the minimum. And villages, 66 of them. Population varies between 155 to 4,600. So that's a description of the incorporated part of this landscape. Then you've got, in 2006, you've got 2006, you've got 27 municipalities, therefore, that had less than 1,000 population, and you had 29, further 29 that had population of less than 2,000. In addition to that, you now have 5 rural communities. Rural communities is this kind of halfway between a local service district and a municipality, okay? And you got 5 of them because that new type of entity was created by legislation in 1995. But over that period of time, since 1995, there has only been 5 of them created. And this is on a voluntary basis. Now, in addition to that, you've got over 260 local service districts, and some have alluded to that since this morning, which covers about 35% of the population and 90% of the territory that have no full-fledged municipal government, but they have some potential. I say potential because they're not all active, but local advisory committees to these local service districts. Now, if you take the total of the local service district and the municipalities, 83% have population of less than 2,000. Okay? Because remember, there are some local service districts that have much more population than certain municipalities. Okay? There's one local service district in particular that has almost 10,000 people, but is compared to a municipality that has 155 people. So basically what we've got now are some glaring, what I call misfits. Okay? Essentially, we have a lot of empty shells. That is, too many government entities for the population that they serve, and therefore they are depriving residents from an effective set of local services. And they are an impediment to collective action all over New Brunswick. And you've got holdouts. That is, you've got local government structure that stand in stark contrast to overwhelming changes in population. Just talked about that a minute ago. The economy and the transportation infrastructure. If you look at these three things, population distribution, the nature of the economy, and transportation infrastructure in 1963, and you look at this today, you're in two different worlds, entirely different worlds in New Brunswick. But we have essentially a local government structure that fits the condition of 1963, or less. Yeah. And we have artificial boundaries galore, okay, in the province. In fact, we have more boundaries that we can handle, okay, in a world where boundaries are counting for less and less. Even provincial boundaries, even national boundaries are counting less and less. Everything is getting to a larger scale, everything is getting global. Yet we are holding to our very small scale type of operation as it relates to local governance. So my final slide will be about having more governments than we ever had before. What we have less governing than we ever had. We govern, a lot of these local governance structures govern very little. And some govern, I would submit, nothing in reality, okay? Because of the issues that were raised by other panelists before. So let me conclude with this. Effective governing requires two ingredients: population and properties, because of the nature of local governance, which the majority of local governments in New Brunswick do not have in large quantity enough. Okay? Decisions are made on the basis of local, i.e. parochial, parameters, while most issues can only be addressed on a much broader scale. Government boundaries, I just alluded to that, everywhere in this country and other countries, government boundaries are increasingly porous, i.e. meaningless. There's less control on what is happening within the boundaries, whether it's provincial, national. There's less and less control on what happens within those boundaries. And therefore, I don't know why we're sticking and insisting that we keep these artificial barriers. Finally, local economy is a misnomer, i.e. economies are at the minimum regional, at best, okay? They are regional at best, and increasingly they are national in nature, and they are even global in nature. And finally, my last point, and is that fewer local services are delivered strictly within municipal boundaries. Whether you look at transportation, whether you look at communication technologies as they have developed, they are transforming most services in such a way that these services are not anymore, for the most part, are not delivered within the boundaries of local government. They are delivered way beyond those boundaries. We were talking about policing this morning. The case can be made that there's no such a thing as purely parochial local policing. It has to be broader than that, okay? The same thing with economic development. We've talked about economic development earlier. Same thing applies there. So my sense is that unless and until we find another set of decision makers that are as courageous as Byrne and Louis Robichaud were back in the 60s, that we're not going to address these particular issues in local governance. And therefore, that's why in my report I suggested that the government take a very comprehensive and I would even say aggressive approach to addressing these particular issues. And unless we are prepared to do that, left at the will of local entities, any change, if we go by the experience of New Brunswick and other provinces, that if that is left purely to the local will, we are probably going to wait a very long time before we've got the fundamental changes that are needed in order to reflect the demographic and economic and transportation and technology changes that have taken place in the last 50 years in New Brunswick. Merci. Thank you very much.
JP?
Very briefly, but this might be the most important piece of information for someone today. There is a silver green Pontiac license plate G IK519 that is about to be towed. Si vous avez un Pontiac argenté vert, j'ai un K519, c'est mieux d'aller vérifier sur votre voiture.
So I wasn't going to identify myself as a recent newcomer until Dr. Hahn did, and I'm even more recent, moving to the province the summer of 2012, and immediately confronting local government issues. During the interview, when I was being driven around by one of the historians in the department, he laid out what the decision was in St. John. You either buy in the valley or you live in the city. And at the time, I was like, okay, whatever. And now, even when I meet people, and we ended up in Rothsay, and everyone still asks me, oh, why'd you live out in the valley? So I blame it. We have two big dogs. And I just always say, well, it's, you know, the dogs. And that seems to get me out of the finicky situations. But I did grow up in a Twin City area in Kitchener-Waterloo in southern Ontario. So very familiar with interesting local governance issues. I thought, and I apologize if I repeat anything, I just got here about an hour ago. I was teaching my Canadian government class this morning. And what the perspective I want to bring to this discussion is politics and representation. And speaking of an intro to Canadian politics class, I don't know if any of you have taken one of those courses recently, but can you guess how much time we spend talking about local government? Maybe five, maybe. If you look in any Canadian politics textbook, how much time is spent discussing local government, which I always argue in class is the level of government that you probably interact with more on a daily basis. The provincial government, obviously with young people, through education, interacting a lot. The federal government can seem very far away from young people. But it's interesting, and that's where I'm going to talk about three different areas of this idea of representation and politics in local government. Because if we break it down, when we think about local government, we can think about the representative nature of it, or we can think about service delivery. So I'm going to talk about representation. I'll start talking about, and when we discuss age, young people. And what does that mean, being an older province, having, I always ask my students if they want to stay in New Brunswick in terms of not knowing what and most say they think they're going to have to leave for work, but they don't want to leave. But when we think about relationships between citizens and their local communities, and this new generation that's coming through, so young people. And we don't know what will happen. It's a mystery because most young people, and this is a term, and Paul Howe on campus here has written about it, in terms of when we talk about civic illiteracy and political dropout. So it's not even that they're just disengaged from local government and politics. They're disengaged from all politics. What does that mean for local government? If there may be concerns around democratic deficits, dependent on how we structure our government, but these are young people who wouldn't even think about any sort of engagement, even though, as most of you know, that local government is one of those places where you can actually go in and speak to your councillors face to face. It doesn't happen like that at other levels of government. So that's the first point in terms of when we think about these demographics and we think about whether there's artificial boundaries or how we define such ideas as community of interest. When this generation that is coming through has really no idea of what that community of interest is. What are we holding on to when we're moving forward in terms of different organization of local government? The second point from a kind of a politics perspective is the notion of federalism. I mentioned earlier when I teach federalism, obviously I talk about Section 92 of the Constitution Act 1867 giving local governments to the provinces. And when we think about where we're going, we know, for example, there's 30 more seats being added in the next election. And we know where most of those seats are being added, in British Columbia, Alberta, and Ontario, and in suburban areas. What does that mean for provinces such as New Brunswick and their local government structures? What does it mean in terms of if the Conservative government, if Stephen Harper wins the next election in terms of putting forward more decentralization? Because in the past, we've seen some governments be much more active in terms of getting involved in the urban agenda. And the Harper government has shown, in most cases, to stay out of that area. So what does that mean when we think about the structure within the province? And then finally, when we're thinking about these different structures, what is the democratic, what is the political result of such things as amalgamation? Now, I'll try to talk about this politician without making any puns or jokes. But you can look at Rob Ford as a result of restructuring from the government of Ontario of amalgamation. Do yourself a favor later tonight and try to find, it's probably not that hard to find, but find a map of the voting patterns for the last Toronto municipal mayoral election and see who voted for Rob Ford. And I don't know if you could find this one, because I've seen this one before, and it shows how close the races were in each poll and how there were no close races in Old Toronto proper. George Smitherman was winning them all by large margins. Just like out in the Horseshoe in the GTA, Rob Ford was winning those polls by giant margins. And I think Ontario is an interesting case of a number, when the Harris government came in, and we talk about the politics of it, a lot of what was behind the Harris government move to reorganize local government structures was things like we have too many politicians, there's too much government, cutting red tape. And we see some of the impacts. I come from, where we moved from, the region of Waterloo, which I would argue, and maybe this is my community of interest, this is my homerism, but has been a very successful model of two-tier government with the regional government, 3 cities and 4 townships. But we've seen other, cities across Ontario where amalgamation has happened: Ottawa, Sudbury, Chatham, and of course Toronto. So I guess, coming in with politics on my mind, teaching political science course this morning, I think that's something that we want to keep in mind on. And especially, if we're talking about these possible young leaders in the future and what they think about when they think about government structures, what's their relationship with government, and can it be something different or unique and dynamic? Thanks.
Thanks, JP. Ray?
Thank you. My remarks are going to be relatively short. I missed, as you are all aware, most of today's session. There was a reason for that. I had an encounter with a moose on Saturday night. I survived. She didn't. But anyway, the result of that was that I had a lot of things this morning to look after. I want to start out by talking about Union Municipalities of New Brunswick. We are an organization of 59 municipalities representing people from all across the province of New Brunswick, the north, the south, the east, and the west. We are made up of cities, towns, and villages, along with rural communities. Jean-Guy alluded to that, the numbers, and in actual fact, we are an organization that represents some of the very, very, very small municipalities who struggle on a daily basis to make ends meet. They have challenges. Hopefully some of those challenges over time will become less, and hopefully it will be through work such as the regional service commissions and things that they will be able to accomplish. I wanted to talk about Byrne a bit and what it meant to New Brunswick, and in particular to rural New Brunswick. I'm one of the people, along with I'm sure a lot of others in this room, who grew up during the part of the Byrne Commission report, who grew up in rural New Brunswick, who grew up in those parts of New Brunswick that were really, really suffering prior to equal opportunity. And if I look at what was offered prior to equal opportunity in the Kent County area, as an example, was very little. People were losing their properties, taxes were high, services were minimum. We had, during the 50s and into the mid-60s, an exodus of people not to the west, but to the New England states. And there were whole communities that were decimated. Few people left, and then the trickle became a flood, and communities disappeared. So equal opportunity in the Byrne Commission report, which led to that, certainly brought about a level playing field for rural New Brunswick in particular. There are areas of New Brunswick, and everyone is aware, if you lived through the early 60s, the mid-60s, that weren't overly happy with Byrne. There were a lot of recommendations that a lot of municipalities and a lot of the wealthier areas of the province certainly opposed. And those, I think over time, there was an understanding reached and realized that certainly things happened for the betterment of the whole province. What has happened since? I think we are all aware that since equal opportunity, a lot of things moved along. And then when we reached areas or periods of the 1980s and 1990s, things started to change.
Regional Service Commission, most of them don't even have the basic land use plan, and don't want it either, by the way. And yet, I guess I see the void for that is they don't want it because they don't understand it. And back to the points that have been made by others on the panel, that opportunity for education and what local governance, what planning, what regional planning, what all of these things can do for you and your community and the positive changes they can influence aren't known to most. I mean, most of the people who came to our table came without orientation, came without any background, and so therefore they're feeling all we want is their tax money. That's why they think we're there. So it's very hard to manage a positive relationship and create collaborative opportunities for us when they come in with those types of suspicions and no real avenues with which to pursue dialogues like regional planning when it's not been a mandated service, when it possibly should be, so that we can begin those very basic discussions that can include not just land use planning, but how you go forward economically, how you go forward in all the ways that will create success.
Is there someone on the panel that would like to address that?
I'll just say thank you for your comment. I had thought about tax policies, but it's it's tricky to look at the effect that tax policies has on population settlement, because there are other jurisdictions where tax rates are very high, and people continue to move in. So there are a couple of intermediary variables to look at as well. And I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on what those might be.
There's a comment over here.
Jean-Paul Savoie, le maire de la communauté rurale de Kedgewick et président de la commission des services régionaux du Restigouche. Juste pour revenir sur les derniers points que M. Finn a mentionnés, nous, dans la région de Kedgewick, on est rural. Puis, on a vécu des décisions gouvernementales que l'on n'a pas comprises. Exemple, la fermeture d'un bureau de ressources naturelles. C'est bien banal, mais pour nous, c'était inacceptable, incompréhensible. On est au centre du territoire, si vous voulez. Puis on a entrepris un mouvement de révolte rurale. Le mot révolte rurale, là, il n'a pas passé bien dans bien des cercles, parce qu'on peut être révolté sans se tirer du fusil. Mais on peut dire qu'il y a un mouvement de révolte rurale parce qu'on assiste à des fermetures comme Bureau de l'agriculture à Saint-Quentin, Bureau de la justice à Saint-Quentin, Bureau des ressources naturelles à Kedgewick. Là, c'est le Bureau de pêche et océan à Kedgewick. Chaque localité a vécu ces décisions où on n'a pas été pris en partie, on n'a pas été consulté. Ça nous arrive parce qu'un ministre dit coupez 4 % de votre budget à tous les ministères, puis à un moment donné, on coupe. Alors, on était très avancé dans notre mouvement, mais on a décidé d'arrêter. Parce que le ministre, M. Paul Robichaud, nous a assuré qu'il essaierait de mettre l'argent nécessaire pour organiser un colloque pour rétablir l'équilibre entre la ruralité et l'urbanité. Donc, il est très important pour les personnes qui sont ici, si vous rencontrez vos députés, puis si vous rencontrez le premier ministre, de dire qu'il faut que le gouvernement entreprenne le plus rapidement possible avec l'Association francophone des municipalités une discussion sérieuse vers l'organisation de ce colloque pour rétablir l'équilibre entre la ruralité et l'urbanité, parce qu'un est complémentaire à l'autre, vous avez entièrement raison, M. Finn. Mais lorsqu'on assiste à des politiques où l'on panique à cause du financement de la province, puis qu'on coupe partout, sans vraiment avoir de vision, à ce moment-là, inévitablement, les gens, parce qu'ils ne comprennent plus, vont se révolter. Donc, avant qu'il y ait révolte, je suggère que le gouvernement, avec nos associations municipales, participe à l'organisation de ce colloque, mais qu'il participe à l'organisation du colloque. Puis on appelle ça, nous, un colloque sur le développement régional pour faute de meilleur vocabulaire. Mais c'est le but, le grand but de ce colloque, c'est rétablir l'équilibre entre l'urbanité et la ruralité, pour ensuite peut-être arriver à des grandes réformes de la gouvernance. Merci.
Merci pour vos questions.
Non, je suis juste un commentaire là-dessus. Je suis d'accord. Et à mon avis, la façon de faire ceci, c'est en mettant sous le même chapeau de gouvernance des communautés rurales et urbaines, plutôt que d'essayer de dire, voici un type de municipalité, c'est rural, et l'autre type, c'est urbain. Si on crée une cinquantaine de municipalités au Nouveau-Brunswick, en partie, ces municipalités-là seront et urbaines et rurales. Et deuxièmement, si on les regroupe dans des commissions comme le gouvernement vient de créer, mais avec un véritable mandat de partager des services sur une base régionale, à ce moment-là, on fera travailler ensemble des communautés rurales et des communautés urbaines. Mais on ne peut pas dans le système. La réalité, c'est que si vous prenez des régions comme Moncton, Saint-Jean, Fredericton, pour prendre ces exemples-là, ce sont des communautés, si vous prenez le Grand Moncton, le Grand Saint-Jean et le Grand Fredericton, en réalité, il n'y a qu'une seule réalité socio-économique. C'est très intégré, socialement, économiquement, à tout point de vue. Le seul domaine dans lequel ça ne l'est pas, c'est l'organisation politique locale. Dans tout le reste, ils sont intégrés. Alors, il y a un disconnect là, entre la réalité socio-économique, telle qu'elle a évolué depuis les années 60, et la structure de gouvernance locale qu'on a à l'heure actuelle. C'est tout ce que je veux faire remarquer.
You can quickly squeeze in one final question over here.
Yes, I'll try and be fairly quick. Kathleen Cruttenden from the Faculty of Nursing, UNB, here in Fredericton. I have more than just an interest. I've spent a lot of time studying geriatrics, so that's That's my clinical area. I did my doctorate in regional planning and resource development health, and guess who was the center of my attention? When I came here, we were putting together an Atlantic housing study, and most of you who work in this area know about that now. But this study not only looked at a survey of all 4 Atlantic provinces, but we've got some excellent data for New Brunswick. We also did focus groups of the very groups who need housing, and they need the services, the supports that go with it. So those things are there. Now, this study, we did it from 2005 to 2010, and it was funded by SSHRC. Now, the other thing that we need to think about, what we're doing here in Fredericton, and we're doing it in communities right across the province, is age-friendly communities. And this is a really good opportunity to get together and talk about what does our community need. Now, we've been through a number of different things, but what we haven't talked about in Fredericton is infill housing. And there are, if you were living in a large city right now, every little piece of land, if you could squeeze a house in, that's where it's going. I'm not suggesting that. We have some very, very large lots, and they're in communities where people look after each other. I think that is really critical. We've got to start thinking about where are we going and what are we going to do in the future. We know we're going to have more aging people around. Look, everybody will be white soon. Anyway, we really and truly have to start thinking about some of these things, and I would encourage you, if you're in your community, to see about age-friendly and what you can do with it. Thank you.
Michael, would you like to respond to anything like that, or?
Just quickly, thank you for your comment. The short story is I agree with you. I think the more we think about how our communities will develop and how we can take care of our various age groups, I think it's absolutely critical. Just to complement what you're saying, I think it's also important to think about what young people might need, because they're typically much less vocal. They'll vote with their feet, so they'll be gone. But at the same time, we see that they're approaching the age at which people typically move. So yes, it's important to look at what's happening at the top end of the age distribution. But one thing that often comes up maybe is that people don't bother because there's an expectation that people are just leaving because of jobs. And you know, that's probably true. But at the same time, I sometimes go into high schools and I'll talk to young people, grade 12s, about their ambitions and their mobility patterns and what they expect in the future. And what often comes out is that, just sort of like what JP did, you get the overwhelming majority of people that are repelling them, and it would be interesting to know what those things are, and see, perhaps this is just part of what happens in New Brunswick. And if that's the case, then we really have to unpack that box and see what it is, what's inside there that's causing people to go.
Michael, if I could respond to that. If we begin, for a long time, we divided populations into groups. What's happening now is we're looking at aging across the lifetime, and that's what you're talking about right now. What that does, too, it begins to make us look at our environments and where everybody fits in.
Mm-hmm.
And that we've heard negative things about the economy that comes through healthcare. Well, maybe we should take another look at that. What else are we doing? Are we creating positions for people to live? One of the things we have a number of New Brunswick community colleges, right? And they're doing all kinds of different things. What about preparing some of our
I couldn't agree more. I did some crude calculations of what occupations will be in demand in the future, and from as far as I can tell, we're training about half of the people that we need to in the health profession. Why isn't that message getting out to young people? Why isn't someone saying to young people that we have an age cohort of people that are relatively wealthy, relatively healthy, that's about to have a whole lot of spare time and money on their hands, and that they can reconfigure themselves around capitalizing on that opportunity?
Great. Well, thank you so much to the panel. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your questions.